Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should help me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator like a...
Hello, my name is Francisco Escobar and welcome to Conversamos. Today we're going to be speaking about conceptualizing Afro-Latinidad in the 21st century. But before we begin, I would like to introduce our panel today. Andres Prolita, Khalil Vasquez, Pilar Esquez Guevara, and Ociel Gonzalez. Thank you all for coming. Co-hosting with me today for this conversation is activist and scholar Valentin Ortiz. Now, Valentin, please start us off by sharing why this conversation is important to you, the Latine community, and then lead us off to our first question.
The most important topics I revolve around is Afro-Latinidad, especially because I founded a student organization while in college based on this topic, the fact that Afro-Latinidad or just the Afro generation in general is not really recognized or is not mentioned as much in the Latinx world. From there, I'd like to start off the conversation. What Afro-Latinas means to each of you.
And to me, Afro-Latino just means, it's just acknowledging what my culture is all about. So when looking at Latinos, people always have the misconstruction that Latinos are just people from Latin America and respecting and honoring that part of ourselves. People think that just it kind of goes into this siloed way of thinking to me, that you are Latino just because you are from Mexico or from Colombia or from the Dominican Republic. But being Afro-Latino encompasses more than that to me. It means acknowledging your full roots, acknowledging that you didn't just pop up on the island, or your people didn't just pop up on that island. I'm Dominican, so my people didn't just pop up in the Dominican Republic. And people were, that culture was created of three different types of people. It was created from the indigenous people that were there, the Spaniards that took over that island, and the Africans that were brought over to work on the island and were enslaved. And so that basically being an Afro-Latino to me means encompassing all of that and that full history of where we come from.
Thank you for sharing, Andres. Khalil and then Pilar, we'd like to take on that.
Yeah, so my name is Khalil Antonio Vasquez. I'm a scholar as well as activist. I think that we really need to, break down how national identities form and like cultural identities form, and what that means for the people in their conception of themselves. So, I'm Puerto Rican, and I think that Afro-Latinidad, because it's not like, for example, there's Afro people in Bolivia or Ecuador, Peru, Mexico, although those places aren't necessarily, when you think about Afro-Latinidad, you think more of like Brazil, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, right? For more. Venezuela, Colombia, Panama a little bit more. With the Arawaks, for example, on the side of like Brazil, Venezuela, and then the Caribbean, because those societies were more, were less state strong. And I mean that to contrast them with like Aztecs or Incas, who had very strong states, like structured states. You had a bit more decimation of that Amerindian side. So you see in terms of like the gene pool, a bit more reflection of a lot more reflection of the African and European in relationship to the Amerindian, versus I would say Mesoamerican or Andean identities having a lot more Amerindian descent.
I wanna just add or build on what I heard you say about what is thought of in general when Afro-Latinidad comes up. And I am from Ecuador, and I think very few people know that there are Black people in Ecuador, because a lot of people associate Black people Black populations with the Caribbean, like you mentioned, or Brazil even, but not really other countries in Latin America or South America. But there are Black populations in all of South America, and there is so I also want to say that I am not Afro Latina. I'm mixed Ecuadorian from the highlands, so I'm not even from the coast.
Thank you, Pilar. We're definitely going to learn more about Raspando Coco as we further into this conversation. As for now, Osiel, how are you conceptualizing Afro-Latinidad?
First of all, I appreciate being in this conversation. You know, I am originally from Cuba. I immigrated to the U.S. at the age of 14. And up until that time, you know, I considered myself white, right? White in comparison to the people around me. You know, we have different shades, but there's this one drop rule in Latin America where, you know, if you have a little bit of white, you can be considered that. And so this perspective of race never really, or of me being an other, never really came into view until I came to the U.S. And I'm saying that really as a positive because it was the beginning of a journey of learning and of exploration, because I was surrounded in Cuba by a massive community of Afro-Cubans of whom I knew nothing, right? In fact, what I knew was that some of them practiced this weird religion and that was devil worship and that I should stay away. And you know, the same structures, economic, social structures that we see in the US, you see in other places where unfortunately, the darker you are, the more likely you are to be part of a marginalized community, or perhaps be lacking in opportunities, or really be kind of discriminated against, pretty much. And that happens in Cuba as much as it happens here, despite all the political differences. So a big thing for me is...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you elaborate a little more on the one drop rule?
Yeah, well, I guess the best way to think about it is the contrast. Whereas in America, the one drop rule is if you have one drop of black, then you're black, right? I mean, if, for example, my wife is black. She's black, she's from Africa, very black. My son is, you know, mixed race, obviously mixed race, but for the world, he's black, right? So the world isn't interested in the nuance of his, you know, genotype, really. He looks like there is some black in there, black. Whereas in Cuba, it's more, you know, there's sort of a spectrum of race. There's like negro, café con leche, you know, you got like vainilla con un poquito de chocolate, like, you know, you got a variety of definitions. And, you know, it follows the same colorist, you know, ideology, like in a lot of other places. The lighter skinned you are, the more valued you are, perhaps, or the more beautiful you're considered, etc. Okay, but you know, and I'm really here more to learn than anything. I know I'm going on this tirade, but a big thing for me, Afro-Latinidad has been about learning about the culture of Afro-Cubans, and specifically the religion Santeria and the Lucumí religion, and how rich it is, and how welcoming it is, and how open it is. There aren't all these tropes about homosexuality necessarily, like you might find in a traditional Christian faith. And it's just been a journey for me, learning and understanding all of it. And I guess my last point is that I teach this culture class here. I teach an immersion community of Spanish-speaking white kids, which is incredible for me. I mean, it's really amazing. And I decided to include some elements of Afro-Latinidad into my curriculum. And so one thing I did was a whole unit on Santeria, right? And the big vocab word that I brought up was syncretismo, which is to say that it's a kind of a mixture of things, I guess. That's how I would see, like, for example, or that you connect with a different culture, like Thor is the god of thunder. And there is a deity in Santeria called Chango, right? And, you know, so there is a syncretismo there. And really, for me, that's really what being Latino is about. and I kind of trying to stay away from labels or whatever. Maybe it's because I'm confused about my own identity, but it's because I don't really fit squarely into any one space. But being Latino for me is like a place where the possibility of this real unity among Spanish-speaking peoples can be real, and where the differences in race, creed, religion then don't matter as much. Because, for example, in Cuba, race and religion mattered a lot. We took the language unity for granted, right? Everybody speaks Spanish, that's fine, that's who we are. But the religion was a divisor and the race was a divisor. Whereas here, it's the language and the heritage is that thing that unites us so much that it allows us to really see the differences as irrelevant.
I'm always interested in like the Cuban culture because I feel like a lot of people. I feel like Cuba is one of the best representations of Latin American and that Afro-Latinidad that we have as an example in the world. For me, I think one of the things that you touched upon that kind of struck me was that percent of like how if you have 1% blood in you, you're Afro-Latino, you're Black. That for me, if you can see me, there's no denying that I'm Black. Like there are people who think they can speak Spanish around me and that I won't understand it because they don't see me as Black. They don't recognize as Spanish. They don't recognize that I'm Latino. So that is the balance and the quote unquote duality that I live with amongst a bunch of things that I live with in my life, but that people see me as Black, so I can't deny that see me as Latino because that is who I am. I speak Spanish. My name is Andres. Like the way I say my name, you can hear that I am Latino, and I connect to that part of my culture. But also, if you just look at me, you can tell that I am Black. So I can't like separate that part of myself, and that is ultimately what Afro-Latinidad means to me. It's a part of me. It's an acceptance of my skin, it's an acceptance of my heritage, it's an acceptance of who I am as a person.
Thank you. And then Khalil?
I think it's a difference, right? We have, I think it's understanding the difference in like what social formations and structures are. And I'm coming from like a social scientific perspective in terms of like, right, like what, like my personal experience, but also like studying and all these things. I think first we need to break down the difference between like North America and Latin America as the big rift, because these two societies, and obviously there's a lot of diversity in each society, but these two societies have generally different conceptions of what it means to be who you are. Now, I mean, I want to give a quick example. I'm gonna give a few different examples of points of like how different this is and why like Afro-Latinidad in our home countries in Latin America is very different from like being here in the United States and all these things. So like, to give an example, right? Like in terms of a system. In North America, right, the one drop rule was applied to Africans. So if you had one drop of African, right, you were excluded. Now, you were African, it didn't matter. Now, that was different in Latin America, whether a Spaniard or Portuguese, because in North America, Northern European from like English, German, Germanic descent, right, would sell their own offspring if they had, because they were half African, right? If you were 3/4 European and 1/4 African, you still were not seen as, you were excluded from being that. And that's contrast to in Latin America from the, right, Spaniards who like of Latin, Southern European descent, right? They understood that first of all, their offspring was their offspring. And of course, their offspring was recognized as their offspring and as a new thing, right? Like you're mulatto, mestizo, whatever it was, right? And down the line, like the point is that basically our nations formed on this basis. And it did form on this basis because when our nations fought for independence, they were already like a mixed bag. They were already a mixed bag of different kinds of people. And of course, there's hierarchies amongst the like peninsulares and criollos, mestizos, and all the different like, right. Not to get into that, but that's very different from that. I think North American identity. That's very different from North American identity, where the 13 colonies strictly one heritage, excluding the other heritages. And I think that plays a different role, even if like people of African descent, depending what country you're from in Latin America, is marginalized.
Thank you, Khalil, for all that. Thank you, everyone, for speaking. One important question that I think I should mention is the lack of representation for Afro-Latinos in the media.
You know, I'm very happy to say that you know, it was empowering to make this film that I made, but I actually I think it was very empowering for the people that I represented in the film, which are people from African descent in Ecuador, in a province called Esmeraldas. It's predominantly of African descent, the population. And I think it was empowering for them. And that was, you know, my greatest satisfaction, you know, actually presenting this film to them. Not just in Esmeraldas, but in other parts of Ecuador, and actually I've presented it in other parts of the world, including the US. And people of African descent and Caribbean people of African descent in particular have seen themselves very much identified and represented.
Thank you, Pilar, and great work creating this documentary in such a careful manner. Valentine, do you have another question for the group?
There's this belief in Latin America that for you to be beautiful or considered beautiful, you have to be a light skin or white. Even growing up, one of the main things that people make fun of you is if you're, you know, morenito, if you're mulatto, if you're dark skin. You know, it's always of like, oh, you're always the negrito in the family. But, you know, it's always this self-hatred inside the cultures, and it makes you ask a question of why is that? Like, why do we have this type of thing in the culture where you have to be the same type of like pigmentation? You know, your man is not appreciated. So it brings me up to my next question of who gets to claim being Afro-Latino?
Who was the NAACP member who said that, who was clearly white and just claimed that she was black? I forget her name, but
Richard Dolezal?
Yeah, Rachel Dolezal. That's an extreme case, but I genuinely think that if you can tie something to yourself, and that's something that you see in yourself, then that's what you are. So if you see yourself and can talk to it about being Afro-Latino, then that makes you Afro-Latino. It's all about self-identity. To me, I respect people's self-identity. I think I see myself as Afro-Latino. I claim that, and I'm proud of that. But like, if another Dominican doesn't think that they're Afro-Latino, then that's not my place to quote unquote put that on them. I feel like it's all about self-identity and accepting who you are and understanding your history, and not like just claiming something just to claim it and because it's beneficial. It's understanding where your family comes, where your people come from, and claiming that and accepting that and making that a part of your identity.
I think in general, right, it's not just, the problem is anti-blackness, like anti-Africanness, right? It has nothing to do with Latino. It's a global thing. It doesn't matter where you go, right? I would say that, in fact, if you want to compare Latinos to any other group in the world right now, we're the only, I think I would say, and I have no problem saying this, that we're the most accepting, because our families are mixed. Like, and it's true though, you have those conceptions, right? But that's not a conception that's also particular to us. Anywhere you go, people who aren't having to do with Africa. If you go to Asia, in India, Asia, right, where there's no real, like, different from the West. When we talk about like the West, like Atlantic, like the Americas, Europe, and Africa, where, you know, this Colombian exchange. Nope, I'm talking about people over there. It's still the same kind of thing. Like, if you're lighter skin, you're more beautiful. If you're darker skin, it's worse. And so I think it's a global thing. And then Latinos, because it's part of a global thing, we're part of the world. We also, you know, we have that, and it's unfortunate. But I think that I think the way we represent ourselves in the mainstream, when we talk about Telemundo and Univision, it's true. But when we talk about, like, when we have our own media, when it comes more from the grassroots, if you look at reggaeton or salsa, and you look at, like, I mean, just look at any like regular, like when they put out like CDs or these things or memes. You know, you see people who, I mean, it's not just a bunch of people who are white necessarily. You see people who you see the majority of people who are mixed, and that includes people who have African descent.
Khalil, if I may jump in there, I don't disagree with everything that you said, but like, it's true that, and again, it's because of this worldview of how we look at things, but it is true that people who are fair skin or lighter skin do become more successful. Looking at like the music realm, someone like Rosalia, who came out of nowhere, who is making Spanish music, and it's accepted as Latin music, is represented and is more acknowledged and promoted for the culture and for the genre in the worldwide media. And she's from Spain. She's not necessarily the Tego Calderons of the world or the Anthony Santos of the world, who, you know, all represent us and look like us and are playing music from our people. It's more people like them who are more shined upon and more promoted. Not taking away from her talent. I love her music. I think she makes amazing, and I'm not to pick on her specifically, but like, it is true that people who are fair skinned and look the part, quote unquote, are promoted more. When you look at novelas on Telemundo and on Univision, again, know that wasn't your main point, but like, those are the people who are getting shown and are getting celebrated instead of people that quote, look like me. You know what I mean?
I just want to jump into a quick point you mentioned there about music and representation. In an interview a couple years ago, J Balvin was interviewed about, yeah, you guys know the game, marry, kill, or fuck. He was given choices. I forgot who the other two people were, but one of the choices was Rihanna. And he mentioned how he wanted to fuck Rihanna. And the person doing the interview asked him, like, wow, really? Like, you wouldn't marry Rihanna? Like, she's a beautiful woman. And he said, those type of women are not the type of women you marry, just the ones you have a good time with. So that was one thing that was forgotten in the media, but ever since then, I never personally listened or like supported J Balvin's music, because it's that type of resentment, that type of like internal hatred you have towards somebody who's of a darker shade than you. And he then went on to say later on in the news that he was joking, but even then, that's one of the things that, oh, you said you're joking now, but for real, you meant it.
One thing that comes up for me is the anti-Black ideology that I believe Khalil was talking about a little bit, and Andres as well. And the issue with that is that we don't always recognize where and how it manifests itself. So maybe J Balvin is not, overtly a racist person. Maybe he grabbed onto that because it's out there, it's floating all over. And we just we gotta have the awareness to identify it as much as we can and fight back, I definitely hear about the idea of Latinos being a very welcoming ethnicity. I think just the fact that we have this very strong bond, but we are, as a community, we come in every color, in every shape, every religion. I was in Cuba maybe a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, and just the interracial couples everywhere, and people are just, it's not an issue. But because I think, and I'm someone who's very pro-America and I love this country and everything, but the way that anti-Black ideology was carefully created and then weaponized, I was learning recently about, because when I'm teaching the Civil War right now, again, to white kids. So I got to really think through this. And I'm like, was there something else about the Civil War? And I did some research, and it was about slavery, really. There wasn't another reason. Slavery was the centerpiece. And one thing that I came across was a massive body of work laying out why slavery is just. It's in line with natural law, why it makes sense, why the white man is destined to be in control, and you know, hundreds of pages of this stuff. And I think that still reverberates, you know, through history, where I don't know that in Cuba there was so much of that. So we're just more willing to mix and to be more accepting.
Thank you for sharing that. Khalil?
So I mean, I think that's a good point. I think as a big history buff, I think what people forget, right? Before the Civil War, there was the Mexican-American War, right? Now, I think this is and I think I use this example all the time as like the pinnacle of Latinidad. So during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 48, the U.S. annexed half of what was northern Mexico, right? We know from California to Texas, that entire territory, that was northern Mexico. The U.S. annexed it. There was a war, right? Now, and this is another thing. This is too long for this, but I don't believe in colors. I don't believe in colors. Obviously, there's like whiter people and blacker people, but I don't believe people are colors in terms of like how they exist as social subjects. I'm gonna leave that there, but maybe you could get this from the example. So in the Mexican-American War, there was a battalion of Irishmen, and it was mostly Irishmen, but they also had some African Americans in it, called the St. Patrick's Battalion, and that battalion fought for the United States, but then defected and switched sides with mostly Irish and some African Americans, and fought for Mexico, because the Mexicans won them over. They said, wait a minute, if you're Irish, you're black, you're African American, what are you fighting for the US for, right? And this is before the Civil War. The Civil War was about, so basically like you had a Latino identity, Mexican, being able to absorb European and African identities. And I think that's really where it's at, right? Like it's a certain continuity of like, there's the Amerindian, but we're not just Amerindian, right? We have the Spanish and the African, and it becomes this new thing. And it's like what was said before, right? Syncretismo, right? Like, I think that's the example of, even though of course it's not perfect, it's all like, it depends who you are, but it's that essence of being able, we're able to adapt and change. And that's what we're about.
This notion that Latinos are really accepting, and we're all Latinos on this call. Like we have to be honest with ourselves and face ourselves. Like if we can't face the world, if we can't talk up to each other and be real with each other, I don't think that we can go out and be real with other people. So there's this notion of being that the Latinos are accepting, and over the most part, yes, we are, and specifically within our families. Like I can't say this about my mother or anyone around me, but there is this notion of adelantando la raza, at least within the Dominican culture, and I'll speak for the Dominicans in this moment. There's this idea that if you bring someone who is of darker skin and of that appearance, that you aren't as acceptance. You have to continue to date people who are lighter and marry people who are lighter and limpiar la raza is what they call it. And this sense of like cleaning our race isn't as the best part of Latinos, and this idea that basically that we're purifying our race isn't the most accepting ideal within us. And I just wanted to touch upon that before we continue within that.
There's different kinds of like overlaps that happen, right? Like you talk about New World, like Afro people in the New World, whether it's Afro-Latinos, West Indians, African Americans, and then like continental Africans. And I think there's lots of different overlaps between that. I mean, and I can speak from my personal experience, right? Like, and it's just like within Latinos, right? Like we're all Latinos, but then there's still like little frictions or whatever differences that we have. Anything that's a difference is gonna, you're gonna feel that little bit of difference. So I think that it's the same thing with the larger African diaspora. There's a lot of this helm of like trying to lead global blackness. So like it's a lot of these tropes with like, oh, we're all black, Latinos are black. But then when it's convenient, and then when it's not convenient, it's, oh, you're not black enough, right? There's one thing. I wouldn't say that happens from the other parts of the diaspora, like West Indians or Africans. I think it's more about like, people, a lot of times it's sharing culture. I feel like Africans and Latinos also share, like Africans from Africa, the continental Africans, and Latin Americans, when we come here, there's a lot of sharing. Even though there's a lot of differences, there's also a lot of sharing, not just cultural ties, like obviously like sharing the beats and salsa and all these things, but especially like the immigrant experience itself, right? There's a certain like immigrant experience that's also shared.
I guess one angle to explore is what is generally the attitude of, what is our attitude, let's own it, what's our attitude towards the African American community in general. I feel like maybe it's not necessarily a take on race, but it's a take on the difference of experience. You know, I definitely have seen a lot of moments, a lot of things where it's not about skin color, it's about them and us, and they, you know, they act a certain way. And so, you know, it's just as a community that wants to be accepted and prides itself in being accepting, we got to reckon with that and think, you know, what is it that we can do to be more accepting and welcoming and to express that openly for the Black community, the African American community, right? The descendants of slaves, basically, in America. So I guess it's more of a question than a point. But
Yeah, just clarify the question though.
Yeah, I guess the question is, okay, let's say that are we creating artificial distinctions here? One thing is culture, right? When I say African Americans, I'm talking about the people, American Blacks, people last named like Brown and Jones and Jackson and stuff like that, right? Sure, that culturally we may be somewhat different, but I think a lot of folks in the Latino community often, and it's perhaps because it's the context of being maybe a marginalized class alongside them and kind of fighting for resources, or, you know, to take it to the political sphere, maybe fighting for a spot in the Democratic Party or whatever. So I just feel like we're in a unique position where we can advance racial justice and understanding. And we also really have to take into consideration American Blacks and what our overall, you know, attitude is towards them and how we can improve it. I feel like it's lacking in some areas.
For me, it's not artificial. Like I can't go outside in the streets and not be Black, not be Latino, I don't have that choice. People are, societal pressures in society and the way society acts is going to look at me like I'm Black. I don't have that privilege that someone else of a fair skin can do that. Like, that's just not my reality. I can tell myself all of these things and I can educate myself and do everything right, and still someone can look at me and because I'm wearing a hoodie think I'm a threat to them. That's not my reality, and I can't personally speak to that. So I disagree with the notion that it's that is kind of a choice. And I don't think that that's what you're necessarily saying all the way, but it's just not. That's kind of how I read it, and so to me, it isn't artificial. It's very real. Like, the way I look and the way that people treat me because of the way I look is a real thing.
The topic that I touch on in my documentary is the uses of coconut. So coconut is it's a tropical seed. It's a palm tree, and it's the seed of a palm tree that grows all over the tropics in the world, all over the world. So everywhere that there are coconuts, there are people that use them to cook. So and a lot of these people are of African descent, or brown people, like people in India or in Sri Lanka, and in the, you know, some Asian countries and Pacific Islands and things like that, or you know, these areas of the world. So I think that's, you know, it was empowering because I think of the way that I managed to represent them. I'm an anthropologist, so I believe in, I didn't want to be the one who speaks for them. I wanted them to speak in the camera and, you know, be the main characters, the ones that actually, you know, make up the film. And so they are the ones telling their stories, and they are the ones actually, you know, acting as authorities of their culture, of their own culture. So I think that is a way that, you know, I helped this particular community, you know, develop a positive representation of them. And that's one of the main goals I had with making my film. It's called Raspando Cocos, scraping coconuts.
Thank you, Pilar. And definitely check the link below to see this documentary. Moving on, Khalil?
Besides, like, there's regional differences, right, of like North America and Latin America, but I think each nation has its own national ideal, right? The national ideal. So I think that, for example, I'm Puerto Rican, right? But I grew up around a lot of Dominicans. Like a lot of my friends are Dominican, right? And I think people think I'm Dominican all the time because of how I look. Because even though I'm Puerto Rican, I'm a little bit darker, but you know, I'm mulatto looking. I get that. So, and I mean, and I would say that just for example, right? Like, right? So like, but that's so like, in terms of I think it's like that, right? Like in terms of Puerto Ricans, I'm not necessarily part of the ideal in terms of like how you see the stereotypically, right? Like, and ideals also work on stereotypes, but that doesn't mean that what ideal Puerto Rican is just white either, right? Because if you're too white, you might not be, right? Same thing with like Dominicans, right? And I think, and the thing is, right, with Puerto Rican is the same thing, right? Like if you're too white or very black, it's not like you're excluded from being that. And I will apply this going like from what I know, because what I know, like Dominicans or Cubans, or like, you know, other people like say Brazilians and all that, you're not excluded, but you're just on the margins of the median, let's say. And then like, for example, like in Mexico, it's like, right, the median will be more like, the ideal will be more of a mestizo person. Now, the thing is exactly like, even though there's a hierarchy in Mexico, we all know this. Obviously, if you're very black and Mexican, like, and they are very dark-skinned Mexicans, right, who are more African descended, they feel that margin. But also, if you're very white and Mexican, I mean, Cameron Diaz is Mexican. People forget that, right? But I mean, she's more American now because she's European. She's whiter. Exactly. It's a lot easier for her to integrate because of how she looks. And I think that, right, you have Latinos who are more majority mixed people. The people who look more European or African come to North America, and they have the ability or choice whether to be either part of their more culture or easier assimilate. The people who look more in the middle, they could try to do that, but it becomes a different thing. Me, I mean, I have African descent. I definitely have visible African descent, but I'm not just African descended. My personal experiences, it could be anything. Like, I'm usually, people always think I'm Latino. Sometimes people think I'm Middle Eastern. Sometimes people see me just as black, but easily, many times a white North American as well as a black North American will ask me, do you speak English? So these are like things that, like, I guess, you know, to think about.
I think that's the overall point that we're getting to. It's not pushing that Afro-Latino part of you aside. It's not ignoring that or just saying you are just black. Like I personally don't see myself as just black. I think Afro-Latino is a more encompassing term. It's representing that side of you that is Latino and representing that side of you that is also black. And so I agree with your point. So.
Yeah, Khalil, don't take Cameron Diaz away from my people, man.
Yeah,
She's Cuban, bro.
He was trying to claim that one in the race.
No. It's all right. You can have her, actually. It's all good.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah, I think my point goes just back to a desire for learning and getting to a place where you have a real, authentic desire to learn about other people and their history and their culture. And their culture goes far beyond just music and food. It goes into family structures and attitudes towards different things. And, you know, just for me, learning about a section of my own culture, because it was closed off to me because of race, it really was a big part of my education, of my self-education, realizing that this part of my national identity of being Cuban was closed off to me because of race. And it was just a mysterious bit that you wouldn't necessarily study. And it was here in the US where I began to study that and learn about it. And it's been great.
Thank you, Osiel, for sharing your willingness to learn. As someone who is rediscovering their indigenous roots, I greatly appreciate that. And on this Red Road journey, I met a lot of indigenous people, and the camaraderie that is being built from hashtag ID Native 2020 to completing the prophecy of the condor and eagle uniting. My question to everyone on this panel, though, is where do you see the camaraderie within the Afro-Latina community? And how is it being developed?
I think there's a bit of a separation there when it comes to indigenous people and Afro-Latino. I would say personally, I don't like using the word Latino as much anymore because then again, conducting research and learning about my history, Latino is a colonizer word, kind of like Latin, Europe. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really give recognition to my ancestors, which were the Afro-Tainos. So I prefer just to use the word Afro-Taino, which emphasizes on both the African ancestors and the Taino ancestors. But there is a lack of I would say of that bridge that we're missing between the African and the Afro-Latino community and the indigenous community. Because even though we say, well, we're Afro-Latino, that's great. I'm glad we recognize our African ancestors. But where do we leave off with our indigenous ancestors? Where do we leave off with the original people of the land? Because at the end of the day, before there were borders, before there were colonizers, there were indigenous people who were the people of the land. And before, the Atlantic slave trade, excuse me. And before everything happened, they were the original people of the land. So where do we draw that bridge where we recognize them as well?
To your point about camaraderie, I think that's the idea. I think when we look at the way that we want to be, the idealistic way and the utopian way of looking at life, that's where we want to go to, but I don't think that we're there yet. I think there's a lot of there's not a lot of acceptance in where we come from and in our true histories of where we are. Like, I think some people think, specifically with looking at our Latinos, or some people think that you have to you have to put something aside to claim Latino. You have to put away that you have to put away that African ancestry to be Latino, or you have to put away that Taino to be Latino, or you have to even put away the Spaniards to be Latino. It doesn't. To me, I think we have to accept all of what came together to be who we are. We have to accept the good and the bad. Like, we have to accept that some of our ancestors were rapists. That is a true fact of where we came from. Some of the people that fathered some of the offsprings weren't the best people, and so it's a collection of all of the good and the bad that makes us who we are, and accepting that and understanding that makes us understand our history.
We need more camaraderie, but if we look in history, there have been attempts, and it wasn't necessarily, the term Afro-Latino wasn't invented then. But if we look at Ramon Emiterio Betances, he was a Puerto Rican revolutionary who fought for the Grito de Lares, and he was inspired by the Dominican Guerra de Restauración, which kicked Spain out in 1865. Because Spain recolonized the Dominican Republic. And at that time, and we could look, I put some of the links so you can look it up, it's called Confederación Antillana. So this idea between Cuba, República Dominicana, and Puerto Rico to make a confederation. And right, when we talk about camaraderie, that's like Betances, Céspedes, Manuel Céspedes in Cuba, and Martí also had these ideas. Luperón in the Dominican Republic also had this idea. Betances and Hostos in Puerto Rico had this idea of us uniting the Caribbean, the Spanish Caribbean, because that way we could defend ourselves against imperial powers like Europe or the United States. And obviously that didn't happen, and we got taken advantage of in the 20th century up until today. And I think that without saying Afro-Latinidad and camaraderie, there was an actual political program put in place, an ideal for to unite our countries, which, it's not everybody, but it was a thought out block to progress that.
You know, if I want to jump in real quick, because there is a connection to race in that, and it's that there's this thing called the Ostend Manifest, which it was an attempt by Southern slave power to expand, to annex Cuba and make it into a slave state. And and this was around that time, I want to say 1850 some, 57 maybe around there. And so if you look at the work of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, like you mentioned, or Jose Marti, uh, their whole ideology is based on anti-slavery and abolitionism. They both that was the essence of their work. Um, I To answer the camaraderie question, I don't know, because I'm not part of that sector of the community, but maybe it exists. I don't necessarily see it, and I don't, you know, I get excited when I see someone else that's Latino, especially up here where I'm at. If somebody's Cuban around here, I mean, I'm excited. But like I said, I also feel like I don't necessarily fit into any one place exactly right, and it just makes me want to makes me just so curious about other people and their cultures, and I always want to be associated with that curiosity, and I hope our community can always be associated with that, because I think once you learn about the other, you are less threatened by the other, and you can feel more at ease to be welcoming and inclusive towards the other.
Great way to put it, OCL. My final question here is on the topic of African reconciliation. And if you do, how do you reconnect with your African heritage? Whether it's from wearing dashikis, eating the food, learning the language, learning the history, or re-citizenizing with Ghana's Century of Return initiative.
I haven't worn these kinds of clothing before. I just didn't know about them, or I like dashikis and things like that. I haven't had an opportunity to wear them, or I don't like it's not common per se. The one time that I tried to wear a dashiki or even think about doing it, um, it just felt weird for me personally. So it never got out so that someone could say like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? It was more of it just didn't feel right to me, per se. Maybe as I continue to learn more about the Afro-Latino culture and more that I continue to learn about my background, then it'll feel right. But it's just in that to this point, it hasn't felt right.
I mean, I discovered later in life, so I'm Puerto Rican. My grandma is more mestiza. My grandfather's a lot more. I mean, he's mixed. He's definitely dark. He's like more African looking, and he used to practice Santeria, and that's something I like. I kind of like. I didn't learn it until like after he passed away, I guess. So it's like, you know, in some ways, yeah. In some ways, I could say it's something that's not like seen as much. At the same time, I mean, in my experience, a lot of people in the Spanish Caribbean, a lot of Puerto Ricans especially, are very much into, like, it's very popular. Like, although, like, of course, some segments are gonna see it as like, right. My grandma grew up more Catholic, so she's very like has a lot of aversion to that. But yeah.
Is Santeria post-colonial religion?
Well, no, I guess it was formed. It's a syncretic religion that was formed like with Catholic saints, and then like it's in Nigeria is they call it Lukumi.
Yeah.
Right. Cuba too, because the whole history behind that. Like Cuba had fresh slaves very like from late until like 1880. So the history in Cuba is a lot more fresh because they had Africans coming in from 1880, whereas you didn't really get that much in Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico. So then you have it as Santeria. So you see, like some people, it'll be the same religion for the most part, but some people they'll use the African deities, Shango, you know, other people. But and then sometimes they'll use like Altagracia.
It's important to recognize that we have, at least personally, I would say 3 different identities. You know, you have the Taino identity, you have the African identity, and then you have the Latino identity. And at times, you know, you have to code switch. You have to choose between each one. It's hard to, you know, miss them. It's hard to keep them together because it all depends on the people that you're with at the moment or the people you're around. You know, when you're around, I would say a certain group of people, African American, If you say, "Oh well, I'm black," I'm African. It's always the notion of, well, you're not black because you're not African American. You're Afro-Latino, and to them, it's not the same thing as to you. And then if you're around certain Latinos who don't recognize themselves as Afro-Latino, or who don't see themselves as, with Taino or indigenous descent, they don't, you say, well, I'm Afro-Taino, but I'm just like Latino, I'm Hispanic, one Spanish, because they have this notion of who they are, and you being around them is more of kind of bothers them. And then there's the notion of you being Afro-Latinas. So you being Afro-Latinas, it depends on the people you're around with. Some people do recognize themselves as Afro-Latinas. I try to keep it together. I try to put it all in one. I would say Afro-Indigenous. I would try to say Afro-Taino at the end of the day. But I think we should have somehow like make it like a bridge so we can all stay connected. All of our identities, because at the end of the day, even though it's true that Latino, I think Khalil, you mentioned it's called by Jose Marti, and that was a great quote, by the way. It is true that Latino misses all of them, all of the parts. But at the end of the day, some people don't feel as comfortable recognizing themselves as Latino just because of the word itself. But yeah, I think when I wore type of outfit or clothing that represents my indigenous culture or my African culture, I will more easily get pulled out in there because people don't see it as that. Like we see it as one identity. They see it as different identities. The dashikis, as you mentioned. If I were, I think I would get called out on it. I've never been in that situation. I've got called out, but I think if I were to like wear it, I would get called out on it.
Very interesting. Thank you for making this point. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you all for coming out for this episode of Conversamos. As for everyone at home, make sure you like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on all of our social media platforms at Conversamos_Latinidad. Tune in next week as we discuss about capitalism, socialism, and communism as it relates to the Latina community as well as across Latin America. All here in Conversamos.
Yeah, yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should chop it and transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore. When I'm breaking through these heavy doors, this is Desert Storm. A metaphor to show I'm equipped and informed. I'm striking with the mega force, I'm lukewarm, your crew swarms. With the fear, my lyrics do harm. If you ain't lending a hand, I'm breaking your two arms, so listen. I'm sniffing the difference on my mission, I'm craving. I envision these premonitions like Raven, I'm gifted. I saved it, now it's time